Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for modern Latin America. Today we are going to talk about a very important and fascinating concept known as transculturation. Transculturation is all about the cultural mixing that will take place among the various ethnic groups of Latin America. What's going to happen is we're going to end up with a culture that is not, well, I should say, a culture that, while it looks Spanish on the surface, in fact is something brand new. As always, there are terms and questions you should be able to answer and identify by the time we get to the end of this lecture. Obviously, you should be able to identify transculturation, and there are also some questions you should be able to answer. Please compare and contrast transculturation and syncretism as we're encountering it in the reading, and then also please try to start working on how you might analyze a culture for elements of transculturation. That said, let's get to it. As always, I like to begin my lectures with an introduction that goes over some of the things that we have discussed already in the semester. One of the concepts that we have discussed is the Spanish conquest of America. That Spanish conquest began with the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Bahamas in 1492. While Columbus was not successful in launching successful colonies in the Americas, other Spaniards who will follow him will be successful in establishing cities and missions throughout the Caribbean. From those Caribbean colonies, Hernando Cortés will launch an invasion of Mexico in 1519 and successfully conquer the rich and powerful Aztec Empire. And from there, Francisco Pizarro, another conquistador, will launch a successful invasion of the Incan Empire, which today is centered in what we call Peru. Now, another concept that we have talked about this semester is the structure of Spain's colonial society. Spanish rule in America was highly centralized. That meant that most of the power was concentrated in the hands of just a few individuals. This is best seen in the viceroy system. The viceroy for each of Spain's colonies was a powerful official appointed by the king himself. It was his job to oversee affairs in his colony. The most important affair with which the viceroy concerned himself was the collection of the royal fifth, a 20% tax on everything produced in the colony. Another example of the centralized nature of colonial society was the Roman Catholic Church. The church was modeled on the church in Rome, with a powerful archbishop in place of the pope. The church was incredibly important because it oversaw all baptisms, marriages, and funerals in the colonies. Without it, a person believed his or her soul would be damned to hell forever if they died. The church and viceroy were closely linked in colonial society. In fact, the viceroy even had the power to appoint powerful church officials. This further centralized power in the colonies. The highly centralized nature of power in the Spanish colonies meant that the citizens of these colonies had no tradition of self-government. Contrast that to Britain's colonies in the north that were developing at roughly the same time. There, each colony was accustomed to having a say in how their colony worked. This will come in handy once the American Revolution breaks out in 1776. But keep in mind, that never happened in Spain's colonies. That tradition of self-government simply is not a part of the Spanish colonial tradition. Finally, another feature of Spanish colonial society was its racial diversity. That diversity was primarily made up of three groups: the Spanish, the indigenous peoples, and Africans. However, it was far more complicated than that, because racial mixing will produce new groups such as the mestizos, a combination of indigenous and Spanish peoples, the mulattoes, a combination of Africans and Spaniards, and the zambos, a combination of Africans and indigenous peoples. These are all topics that we have previously discussed in class thus far this semester. However, now let's look at something new. That something new is transculturation, and here is what it means. Imagine transculturation as 1,000 tiny confrontations and tacit negotiations taking place in people's daily lives, always within the force field of hierarchy and domination. The people on top are usually able to impose the broad outlines of things, with those below contributing subtle aspects more difficult to police from above: style, rhythm, texture, and mood. Now let's look at that definition bit by bit. This part shows that transculturation involved the regular interaction of different racial and ethnic groups on a day-to-day basis. In other words, it was something that evolved slowly over time. Notice what he's saying here. 1,000 tiny confrontations and tacit negotiations. This is not big change that occurs all at once. This is a subtle change, more of an evolutionary change. And so don't look for big things. Look for little things here and there when we're trying to understand transculturation. This section, that it always takes place within the force field of hierarchy and domination, really flies in the face of this notion that we have in American culture known as the melting pot. The melting pot argues that all of these cultures came to the United States and melted together to create a unique American culture. Now, that's not transculturation. Transculturation assumes that the various groups do not mix their cultures equally. Instead, as it says, transculturation exists in an environment of power, where one group dominates the others. The next part says, the people on top are usually able to impose the broad outlines of things. Now this affects the cultural interactions that are occurring among the various cultures and peoples within a society. And it argues that those at the top of society are able to force the lower groups to accept and adopt their culture. However, the lower groups do not simply accept that culture that is forced upon them. Instead, they change it in small and subtle ways that are often not even noticed by those at the top. Now, let's take a look at an example of transculturation. This is a crucifix that stands in one of Mexico City's Catholic churches. The crucifix is one of the best recognized symbols of Catholicism. In fact, Mexico is an overwhelmingly Catholic nation. Catholicism, of course, was brought to the Americas by the Spanish, who forced native peoples to convert. In other words, the broad religious culture of Mexico is Spanish. This is what the quote highlighted earlier meant when it said, the people on top are usually able to impose the broad outlines of things. In this case, the people on top would be the Spanish. The broad outline would be Roman Catholicism, the Roman Catholic religion. But this crucifix is not like those that would be displayed in Catholic churches back in Spain. Instead, it has been altered in a way by the indigenous peoples to fit their own manner of worship. This is what the quote meant when it said, with those below contributing subtle aspects more difficult to police from above, style, rhythm, texture, and mood. So, how has the crucifix been altered? Look closely. This crucifix is covered in blood. It just so happens that human blood was sacred to the Aztecs and other pre-Columbian cultures. It was believed that the Aztec gods ate human blood. And thus, to keep them happy, the Aztecs sacrificed thousands of people to their gods every day. Those Aztec gods are gone now today. However, the blood remains. It is just now that it is Christ's blood that is being featured. That is transculturation. There are hundreds of examples of transculturation in Latin American society today. In our next lecture or class, we will begin to explore some of those examples in an attempt to better understand this fascinating process.